My name is Remington Walsh. I'm 33 now, and I still remember every single word my mother said on that phone call, as if the sound of her voice had been etched into my memory by fire. It was a Tuesday morning in late November, and the chill of the Baton Rouge air had seeped into my apartment despite the heater humming in the corner. I had just returned from my night shift at the daycare center where I worked, my uniform still carrying the faint scent of crayons, peanut butter, and little sticky fingerprints that always seemed to cling to me no matter how many times I washed my hands. The phone rang. It was my mom, Clyde and Anita Walsh, my parents. My stomach dropped even before I answered. There was a strange tone in her voice, one I couldn't place immediately. "Remington," she said, her voice tight, almost strained. We don't have the money for your surgery." I froze. My mouth opened and closed, trying to find words, but nothing came out. What do you mean? You said, "We don't have the money," she repeated firmly. "You'll have to take care of it yourself. We just can't." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I remember gripping the edge of my kitchen counter so hard my knuckles whitened. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the occasional bark of a dog, and yet, all I could focus on was the emptiness in her voice. She wasn't apologetic. There was no hesitation. Just cold, calm practicality that was utterly shocking. I had been waiting for this help for months. The surgery wasn't optional. It was life-altering. And here they were, my own parents saying no. I swallowed hard, trying not to let the tears show. I understand," I said, though I didn't. Not even a little. "Good. We're sorry, Rem. Really, we are. But it's just, the money isn't there." She hung up without another word. No "love you," no "we'll figure something out." Nothing. The line went dead. I sat at my tiny kitchen table for what felt like hours. My coffee had gone cold. My hands were shaking. The world around me, my cramped apartment filled with hand-me-down furniture, my half-eaten lunch still on the plate, the stack of overdue bills on the counter, suddenly felt suffocating. And I thought, how could they? How could they choose him over me? Less than 2 weeks later, I saw it. Not on the news, not in a letter, but driving past the Walsh house. My parents had bought my younger brother Jet, a boy who had never once shown the slightest hint of responsibility or gratitude, a brand new Audi S3, $50,000, just like that. My fingers curled around the steering wheel until my nails cut into my palms. The bright red paint gleamed in the sunlight, the chrome rims sparkling like they were mocking me. And Jet, laughing, leaning casually against the hood, showing off the keys like a trophy. I don't know how long I sat there in the car staring. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe an hour. I don't remember. All I remember is the burning sense of betrayal, the sudden icy realization that my parents had always put Jet first. Always. I wasn't angry. Not really. I was furious, heartbroken, humiliated. And then, I went silent. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't reply to their emails or letters. For an entire year. My parents' birthday wishes, my brother's texts, even the holiday cards, they all went ignored. I disappeared from their lives, and it felt liberating in a strange, painful way. I wasn't avoiding them for spite. I was protecting myself from the hurt they had caused, from the constant reminder that, in their eyes, I was always second. Life in Baton Rouge went on, in the meantime, in the small, quiet rhythm I had built for myself. I worked at a preschool in a little center near the river, a job that barely covered my rent, the electricity, the phone bills, and the occasional splurge of chocolate or takeout. But I loved it in my own way. I loved seeing the little kids learn, seeing the wonder in their eyes when they figured out something for the first time, the simple joy of a crayon drawing, a lopsided tower of blocks that made them giggle with pride. Those little moments were my happiness, my solace, my escape from the chaos that my family had always represented. Money had always been tight for me. Always. I rented a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Baton Rouge, the kind of place where the radiator rattled, and the shower had that faint smell of mildew that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove. I didn't have a car fancy enough to impress anyone. My wardrobe was practical, unremarkable. But I survived. And in my own way, I thrived. I had independence. Something Jet had never been taught. Something my parents didn't understand. Something they had never valued in me. Growing up, our house had been the same story. Clyde and Anita Walsh never struggled in the obvious way, never worried about bills or repairs or running out of groceries. They lived in the same three-bedroom home on the edge of town where I was raised. A house with a big driveway and a garage that always had room for Jet's toys, his truck, his newest gaming consoles. I learned early that nothing in that house revolved around me. Jet could demand anything: new designer clothes, a lifted truck when he turned 18, the latest gaming systems, and it was never a problem. My achievements, my struggles, my needs, I learned quickly that they didn't matter. Not really. Jet was the loud one, the charming one, the one they bragged about even when he flunked classes or got suspended. I was quiet, diligent, responsible. I followed the rules, studied hard, and stayed out of trouble. And somehow, that made me invisible in my own home. I wasn't jealous at first. I accepted it. I didn't question it because that's how our family worked. That's how it had always been. When I left for college, scholarships and part-time jobs in tow, my parents made it clear: you're on your own. Real adults figure things out. And I did. I figured it out. I learned independence and responsibility in ways my parents never did for me. Meanwhile, Jet dropped out after a single semester and moved into a fully furnished apartment paid for by my parents, rent covered, utilities included, just so he could find himself. For years, I swallowed the resentment. I smiled when they came over, pretending everything was normal. I congratulated Jet on his new car, on his promotions, on his vacations abroad, all while keeping the quiet anger bottled up inside. It wasn't easy. It never was. But I survived. I learned to navigate my world without their approval, without their help, and in some ways, that made me stronger. And then, one cold winter night, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Something that would change everything, but not in the way they expected. I was sitting on my worn-out couch, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea, scrolling through my phone and trying to ignore the holiday decorations that already cluttered my street. The knocking on the door came suddenly, sharp, insistent. My first thought was a neighbor in trouble, maybe someone lost, maybe a salesperson. But when I opened the door, I froze. There were my parents, disheveled, eyes wide, voices trembling. They looked like they hadn't slept in weeks, like the world had finally caught up with them, and they didn't know how to survive it. Panic radiated from them in waves. My mother's hands shook. My father's jaw was tight. For the first time in my life, they looked helpless. And they were looking at me. Remy, please. We need your help, my mother stammered. I stepped back, keeping the door closed, my heart pounding in ways I didn't understand. My mind raced. This was the moment I had imagined for years, a reckoning of some kind, but I didn't expect the way it would feel. Anger? Yes. Satisfaction? Maybe. But there was also a strange, gnawing curiosity. How had it come to this? Why were they here now, begging me? I didn't answer immediately. I just watched them, my parents, the people who had ignored me, sidelined me, let me struggle while Jet lived in comfort. I could feel the power had shifted, though I didn't yet know what that meant. That night, the night they appeared at my door, would mark the beginning of something new. Something that would change everything, not just for them, but for me. and I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. I've spent a lot of time thinking about childhood, about the moments that shape us, the small, invisible decisions that define the rest of our lives. For me, growing up in the Walsh household was like living in two separate worlds at the same time, one visible, one invisible. One world belonged to Jet, my younger brother, where every whim was indulged, every misstep forgiven, every achievement celebrated as though the world depended on him. The other world, my world, was quiet, hidden, overlooked, and often dismissed. I remember being 5 or 6 years old and standing in the kitchen, watching my mom fuss over Jet's breakfast. Pancakes shaped like cartoon characters, syrup artfully drizzled in spirals, little chocolate chips forming eyes and mouths. Meanwhile, my own bowl of cereal, plain, unadorned, boring, sat untouched as she whisked Jet off to the car, telling him, "Have a great day, sweetheart." I didn't complain. I never did. Complaining didn't help. It only seemed to make me more invisible, like a whisper that echoed into the void. Jet, on the other hand, had a natural way of drawing attention. Loud laughter, quick wit, easy smiles. He was magnetic in the way some people are just born to be. Teachers loved him, neighbors adored him, and my parents? They practically worshipped him. It wasn't that I lacked charisma. I simply didn't learn early enough that being seen wasn't just about talent or effort. It was about charm, timing, and being in the right place at the right time. Jet had that. I had diligence, patience, and a knack for staying under the radar. School was no different. Jet struggled. Bad grades, missing assignments, suspensions. He did it all. And yet, every time he came home, he was met with consolation, gifts, and encouragement. "You'll get it next time, sweetie," my mother would say. "We believe in you." Meanwhile, I was getting straight A's, working part-time jobs to help pay for my own textbooks, and rarely heard more than, "That's good, Remy. Keep it up." The words were polite, but they never carried the excitement or pride I saw reserved for Jet. By the time I reached high school, the pattern was painfully clear. My parents had favorites. Jet, always. I accepted it because there was no alternative. I didn't fight. I didn't lash out. I internalized it, storing every slight, every overlooked achievement, every moment I felt invisible. Like coins in a jar I would one day open and let them fall all at once. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was responsible, that independence was better than entitlement. And for the most part, I believed it. But there were nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I would ever be enough in their eyes. Leaving for college was liberating, in more ways than one. I had earned scholarships, juggled part-time jobs, and for the first time, I was free from the constant reminder that my efforts didn't matter. Yet, even then, the shadow of Jet's favoritism loomed. My parents would call him on the phone, asking how his day went, what he was eating, how his friends were, while I received a perfunctory, "Hope school's going well." It stung every time. And Jet? He didn't struggle as much as I did. Not really. He dropped out after one semester, complaining about how boring college was. My parents didn't scold him. They didn't lecture him on responsibility. Instead, they paid for a fully furnished apartment, covered his bills, and somehow managed to make him feel like he had made a brave, independent choice. I couldn't understand it then, and to be honest, I still don't. The contrast was brutal. I was supposed to navigate life on my own, scraping by with part-time jobs and cheap textbooks, learning to budget, to prioritize, to survive. Jet got everything handed to him, and when he stumbled, they cushioned him like a bubble wrap around a fragile object. At first, I tried to ignore it, to accept it as the way life was. But as the years went on, the unfairness became harder to swallow. I loved my brother, but I couldn't love the way my parents had chosen him over me. Home visits were the worst. Walking into the Walsh household, smelling the faint scent of fresh bread or Jet's cologne, everything screamed Jet. His trophies lined the shelves, his art projects, his sports medals, his first paycheck from his job at the mall, everything meticulously displayed. And me? I had nothing. My achievements were acknowledged politely, maybe a nod or a fleeting smile, but never celebrated, never displayed, never enough. I remember one particular Thanksgiving. I had worked extra hours at the daycare to save up for a small gift for my parents, a handmade photo frame with a picture of all three of us as kids. I thought it would mean something. When I handed it to my mom, she smiled, nodded politely and said, "That's lovely, Remy. Jet will love it too." And then she turned her attention to him, showing him the frame, asking him what he thought, what he liked, what he didn't. I stood there, silent, holding my empty hands, feeling smaller than ever. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had learned to shield myself emotionally. I built my own world, my apartment, my routines, my job, and my friendships outside the Walsh household. I made peace with the fact that I wasn't going to receive validation from them. I didn't need it. And yet, the memory of their favoritism lingered like a shadow at the edge of every family gathering, every phone call, every fleeting interaction. It wasn't just material things. It was the love, the attention, the belief that one's achievements mattered. Jet was allowed to stumble, to fail, to cry, to complain, and he was celebrated anyway. I succeeded, excelled, persevered, and the acknowledgement was lukewarm at best. The message was clear. I was expected to survive. Jet was expected to shine. And then came the surgery, the moment that brought everything to the forefront. I needed help. $25,000 I didn't have, couldn't possibly afford on my own. I called my parents, expecting at least some acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. Instead, I got a cold, practical refusal. "You'll have to take care of it. Yourself." Nothing else. No concern, no empathy, no hesitation. 2 weeks later, I drove past their house and saw the red Audi S3, a brand new luxury car gleaming in the driveway. Jet was laughing, leaning casually against it, like the world had always belonged to him. I felt something crack inside me. The silence began that day. I disappeared from their lives, cutting off calls, texts, messages, everything. For a full year, I lived in the quiet world I had built for myself, away from the chaos of favoritism and neglect. Yet, even in my silence, the past was never far. I carried it with me like a shadow, a constant reminder of what I had endured, of what I had learned about family, fairness, and survival. I had accepted my parents for who they were, the way they had always been, but I had not forgiven them. Not yet. And little did I know, the day would come when the world would shift again, when the roles of caretaker and dependent would reverse, and when my parents, the very people who had disregarded me for so long, would come to my door, desperate and panicked, seeking help. That day would change everything. Until then, all I could do was remember, reflect, and brace myself for the inevitable reckoning. The silence started the day I drove past that gleaming red Audi S3 in my parents' driveway. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic silence with ominous music playing in my head. It was quiet, cold, resolute. I didn't answer calls. I didn't return texts. I didn't respond to emails, letters, or even the occasional messenger app ping from Jet. For an entire year, I didn't reach out. I didn't speak to them. I vanished from their carefully curated version of the family, leaving a void where I had once existed. That year wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I didn't disappear because I wanted to punish them, although part of me did, but because I needed to protect myself from the relentless sting of favoritism and neglect. every interaction with my parents had been a reminder that I would always be second, that Jet would always be first, that my struggles didn't matter. I didn't want to be reminded anymore. I wanted to exist without that weight pressing down on me. At first, it felt surreal. I would see my phone light up with calls labeled Mom or Dad or Jet, and I would sit there staring at it for minutes, my fingers hovering over the screen. I wanted to answer. I wanted to hear their voices, to tell them that it hurt, to demand acknowledgement. But I didn't. I set the phone down, turned away, and let the silence grow, thick and impenetrable. I had no words that could fix what had been broken. Silence became my shield. In the beginning, I felt guilty. A twinge of guilt that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I should just forgive and move on. But the guilt faded as the months passed, replaced by a steady resolve. I was not their child to be ignored. I was not invisible. I had built life for myself in Baton Rouge, a small apartment downtown, a modest but fulfilling job as a preschool teacher, a world that was mine and mine alone. And I thrived in that world, despite the financial struggles and long hours. Working at the daycare center became my anchor. It wasn't just a job, it was a sanctuary. The laughter of the children, their sticky little hands reaching for mine, the wonder in their eyes as they discovered the simplest joys, became my daily reminder that I mattered somewhere. I mattered in a way that wasn't conditional on perfection, on being loud, or on being Jet. I began to rebuild myself in that silence. I took care of my apartment, learning to budget meticulously, to stretch a paycheck further than I thought possible. I cooked simple meals, experimented with little recipes I found online, and found pride in small accomplishments. A perfectly balanced checkbook, a successful DIY repair, a lesson plan that went off without a hitch. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't praised by anyone at home, but it was mine. And yet, the memory of their favoritism never fully left me. It was a dull ache at the back of my mind, a quiet reminder that, for all my independence, I had been overlooked for so long. Every holiday without a word from them, every birthday ignored, every small success celebrated in their house without my name being mentioned. It all built into a slow-burning tension that grew steadily throughout that year. Jet continued with his life as if nothing had changed. I would hear from friends or social media posts about his latest adventures, his expensive trips, his new gadgets. He seemed carefree, untouched by the consequences of responsibility, and my parents continued to cater to him without hesitation. At first, I felt jealousy, but it wasn't really jealousy. It was frustration, a deep, simmering resentment for the fairness I had never been given. I started to notice patterns in myself during that year of silence. I became more self-reliant than ever. I saved every extra dollar, learned to handle problems alone, and found strength in knowing I didn't need their approval to succeed. I realized how much I had been underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked, not just financially, but emotionally. And that realization, bitter as it was, became a fuel that drove me forward. I remember one evening, sitting alone in my apartment, rain streaking the windows, the soft hum of the radiator filling the room. I was grading papers from the daycare, listening to the quiet, when I thought about the last time I had spoken to my parents. It was the call where my mother told me they didn't have the money for my surgery. That call had shattered something inside me. And yet, in the quiet, I realized that I had survived. I had worked through pain, disappointment, and neglect, and I was still standing, stronger, wiser, more aware of my own worth. During this year, I also reflected a lot on family dynamics, on the way favoritism shapes relationships, and on why some people are consistently given opportunities while others are expected to scrape by. I realized that my parents had always loved Jet in a way that was unconditional, blind, and sometimes irrational. That love wasn't wrong, but the way they applied it, to the exclusion of fairness, was devastating. I started to understand that my silence wasn't just a form of rebellion, it was an act of self-preservation. Friends became my surrogate family. I leaned on them for support, for validation, for companionship. Even small acts, a coffee with a colleague, a text from a friend checking in, a shared laugh, felt monumental compared to the emptiness I had felt at home. For the first time, I began to see that family wasn't just about blood. It was about who saw you, who celebrated you, who cared for you without conditions. And in that sense, I began to heal. Yet, despite the healing, there was always a part of me that wondered, what if they really needed me? What if one day the balance shifted and I became the one with power, the one with knowledge, the one they had no choice but to turn to? I didn't hope for it. I didn't plan it. But I knew, deep down, that when it happened, I would be ready. The year passed in quiet increments, seasons changed, leaves fell and were swept away, and the world outside my apartment moved forward. I celebrated small victories quietly, a raise at work, a child learning to tie their shoes for the first time, a paycheck that finally allowed me to replace my worn-out shoes. These moments were my validation, my quiet rebellion against the system of favoritism that had defined my childhood. And then, one winter night, everything shifted. I was sitting in my apartment, a cup of tea in hand, reading a book, when there was a knock at my door. Sharp, urgent, insistent. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A cold gust of wind followed the knock, bringing with it the faint scent of winter and something else, something unfamiliar, something urgent. When I opened the door, I didn't expect to see them, my parents, Clyde and Anita Walsh, looking utterly disheveled, exhausted, panicked. Their eyes were wide, their hands trembling, their faces pale. For the first time in my life, the people who had always held power over me looked utterly powerless. And they were looking at me. Remy, please, we need your help, my mother said, her voice breaking, her composure gone. I felt something shift inside me. Anger, yes, but also a strange, simmering curiosity. What had happened? What could possibly bring them here, to my quiet apartment, after a year of silence? My heart raced, my mind whirled with memories of the past, of all the ways they had ignored me, of all the ways Jet had been celebrated while I was overlooked. And in that moment, I realized that the year of silence, the year of self-preservation, had prepared me for this. I was no longer the same child, the same quiet, overlooked sibling. I was someone who had survived. The knocking on my door that winter night was sharp, almost violent, cutting through the quiet hum of my apartment like a warning bell. I had been sitting on my couch, tea in hand, listening to the soft scratch of wind against the windows, thinking about nothing in particular when the sound jolted me upright. At first I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone, not my parents, not Jet, not anyone. I was alone, safe in the cocoon of my apartment, far removed from the chaos of the Walsh household. But the urgency in the knocking, the insistence, told me immediately that this wasn't a casual visit. Something had happened. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a familiar mixture of dread and anticipation. With a slow, deliberate motion, I set my tea down on the side table and walked to the door. My fingers lingered on the knob as my mind raced through possibilities. When I opened it, the sight that greeted me stopped me cold. My parents, Clyde and Anita Walsh, stood there, looking like shadows of themselves. Their hair was disheveled, their clothes wrinkled and smeared with dirt, or some unknown substance, their eyes wide and frantic. They looked as if they hadn't slept in weeks, as if the world had turned against them, and somehow I was their only hope. Remy, my mother's voice cracked, trembling. She clutched my father's arm, her knuckles white, as if holding on to him could anchor them in the storm. Please, we need your help. I stepped back, keeping the door between us, my chest tight. My mind spun. Panic? Desperation? What could possibly have brought them here? My parents, the people who had ignored me, sidelined me, made Jet the center of the universe, were standing on my threshold, looking broken and afraid. It was surreal, almost cinematic in its absurdity, and yet the fear in their eyes was real. "What happened?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. I had spent a year building walls, cultivating silence as a shield, and now those walls were being tested. My father shook his head, his usual composure gone. We messed up, Rem. We didn't see it coming. We didn't know what to do." His voice wavered, a tone I had never heard from him in my life. Vulnerability, genuine, raw, and unsettling. I blinked, trying to process it. "I don't understand. What happened?" My mother's voice broke again. "It's Jet. He's in trouble. Serious trouble. We don't know how to fix it. Please, you're the only one who can help us." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I stared at them, disbelief and incredulity fighting with a slow burning satisfaction. The roles had reversed. For once, the people who had always wielded control, who had always dictated the terms of fairness, who had always put Jet above me, were powerless. And I was the one with the answers, the resources, the ability to help. Or not. I could feel the anger rising, the memory of the phone call, the surgery, the Audi S3, all of it converging into a single blazing point of clarity. For years, I had endured favoritism, neglect, and the constant reminder that I was secondary. And now, here they were, begging for my help, stripped of dignity and pretense, relying on the one person they had overlooked for so long. But there was also curiosity. I wanted to know everything: what had happened, why they were here, why they hadn't planned ahead, why, after all these years, the world had finally forced them to face me as an equal. My parents had always assumed I would bend, silently obey, comply without question. They had never imagined that I could, and would, stand my ground. I gestured for them to come in, though part of me hesitated. The apartment felt suddenly small, the space between us heavy with unspoken words. My mother's hands shook as she entered, clutching her coat to her chest. My father followed, his eyes darting around as if expecting the walls themselves to judge him. "Sit down," I said, motioning toward the couch. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." And so they did. The story spilled out, fragmented and frantic. Jet had made a series of reckless decisions, financially, legally, personally, that had snowballed into a crisis they couldn't manage. They had tried to cover for him, to fix things quietly, to prevent the scandal from reaching anyone else. But everything had spiraled out of control. And now they were desperate, knowing that without my help, there would be consequences they couldn't bear. I listened, silent, letting their panic wash over me. The fear in their eyes, the tremor in their voices, the helplessness. They were all so familiar yet so reversed. I had lived a year in silence, building strength, independence, and resilience. I had learned to navigate crises on my own. And now, the people who had once dictated my life were relying on me to save theirs. The tension in the room was suffocating. My parents glanced at each other, then at me, as if searching for mercy, understanding, or forgiveness. But I wasn't sure I could give any of those things, not yet. The power dynamic had shifted, yes, but the wounds ran deep. I could help them, of course. I had the knowledge, the resources, the ability. But I also knew that this was a reckoning, a chance to make them confront the consequences of their past decisions. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, not cruelty, but clarity. The world had forced them to recognize me, to acknowledge my strength, my independence, my worth. And for the first time, they were the ones who had to plead, to justify, to appeal to someone they had once disregarded. "Rem, please," my mother whispered again, her voice breaking. "We don't know what else to do. You're the only one we can turn to." I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch. The room was heavy, the air charged with anticipation. Outside, snow began to fall, a delicate, silent reminder that winter had fully arrived, a season of endings and beginnings. And in that moment, I realized something fundamental. Nothing would ever be the same again. That night marked the beginning of a shift in power, a confrontation with the past, and a test of family loyalty. I could choose to help. I could choose to walk away. But either way, the events of that winter night would leave scars, truths, and revelations that none of us could ignore. I leaned back, letting my parents' desperation settle around me, and said quietly, deliberately, "Tell me everything from the beginning. No details left out. I need to understand exactly how we got here." The night stretched on. Words tumbled out, explanations intertwined with excuses, tears mingled with frustration, and for the first time, I truly saw my parents, not as authority figures, not as caretakers, but as human beings, flawed, desperate, and completely dependent on the one person they had taken for granted for so long. It was a night of reckoning, of confrontation, of clarity, and it was only the beginning. The events of that winter night left me in a state of uneasy awareness. My parents, Clyde and Anita Walsh, sat on my worn couch, exhausted, panicked, and desperate, spilling out every detail of Jet's spiraling mistakes. I listened as they described the debts he had racked up, the threats of legal consequences, and the mounting pressure from creditors and acquaintances. Every word, every pause, every tremor in their voices reminded me of the year I had spent in silence, the long months of being ignored, the countless times I had been sidelined in favor of Jet. And yet, despite the anger, despite the resentment, I realized something I hadn't expected. I had the power to change the outcome. I could help them, yes. I could fix the problem. But I could also let it play out as it deserved to, letting them face the consequences they had long avoided. For the first time in my life, I was in control, and the decision was mine alone. I leaned back, my fingers interlaced, and watched their faces. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, glistening with tears. My father's jaw was tight, his hands shaking ever so slightly as he rubbed them together. They looked older, frailer, stripped of their usual composure and authority. It was surreal, almost cinematic. These were the people who had once ruled my life, who had dictated who mattered, who had indulged Jet at my expense. And now they were utterly vulnerable. "You need to understand something," I said slowly, my voice calm, steady. "This isn't just about fixing Jet's mess. This is about everything that's come before. The surgery, the Audi, the favors, the favoritism. Every single thing matters. You've ignored me for years. Now you're asking for help. Do you even realize what that means?" My mother opened her mouth, but no words came out. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The silence stretched, heavy, thick, suffocating, until finally I continued. "I could help him. I could bail him out. I could smooth this over so it's like nothing ever happened. But that wouldn't be justice. That wouldn't be fair. And fairness is something you've never understood. Not for me. Not for anyone you've favored. So before I make any decision, I need the truth. I need to hear from both of you exactly why I was always second and why Jet was always first." The room grew even quieter. They exchanged glances, a mixture of guilt and fear, neither daring to speak first. Finally, my mother sighed, a trembling sound that seemed to release years of pent-up tension. Remy, we we made mistakes, she began, her voice small, almost childlike. We thought we were doing what was best. We we wanted Jet to be happy, to be confident, to succeed, and we thought you didn't need us the same way he did. We were wrong. We see that now. But it was never about not loving you. You have to believe that. I studied her face. Love? Their version of love had been conditional, skewed, and unequal. But there was regret there, faint as it was, and maybe that mattered. My father spoke next, his voice low, hoarse. We wanted to protect both of you in our own way. But we failed you, Remy. We always failed you. And now we're paying the price. Jet, he's in trouble, and we can't fix it without you. Please, help us. I felt the anger rising again, that familiar, bitter heat. And yet, I also felt something else. The strength I had gained during my year of silence, the resilience, the self-reliance. I had endured, I had survived, and now I had the ability to choose, not because I owed them, but because I wanted to, on my own terms. I took a deep breath and made my decision. I will help him, I said, my voice steady, but not without conditions. This ends tonight. You need to understand something fundamental. The way you've treated me, the way you've favored him over me, cannot continue. If I help Jet, it's because I choose to, not because you expect it. You're going to treat me with respect, with fairness, and with honesty from now on. Otherwise, don't expect my help, and don't expect me to be involved again. Tears welled up in my mother's eyes. My father nodded, swallowing hard. Relief, desperation, guilt, they were all there, mixed together in a volatile cocktail. I could see the realization dawn in their eyes. For once, the world was not entirely in their control. And I was the one holding the leverage. Jet's arrival, when it came, was like watching a storm hit the shore. He barged into my apartment, confident and casual at first, until he noticed the expressions on our faces. Panic replaced his usual bravado as he realized the gravity of the situation. The debts, the creditors, the legal threats, they were real, and there was no one to shield him this time. I looked at him, my younger brother, the one who had always been celebrated, always indulged, always allowed to stumble without consequence. I saw him clearly for the first time, not as the charming, invincible boy my parents had portrayed, but as someone who had coasted through life on others' generosity. And now, he had to face reality. Jet, I said quietly, my voice carrying a weight he hadn't felt before. This is on you. I can help, but you need to understand what this means. You've made mistakes, serious mistakes, and you need to take responsibility, finally. He looked down, shame spreading across his face like wildfire. For the first time, I saw the vulnerability, the fear, the realization that life was not a game and that his parents' indulgence had limits. And for the first time, I felt a strange sense of hope, not for them, but for him. Maybe he would learn, maybe he would change, maybe fairness and responsibility would finally enter the Walsh household. We spent the night sorting through the mess, calculating debts, contacting lenders, planning how to navigate the legal issues. My parents hovered, silent and repentant, while Jet followed my lead, awkward and humbled. By morning, the chaos had been contained, the immediate crisis managed. But the emotional reckoning lingered. I sat back on my couch, exhausted, the weight of the past year pressing against me. My parents were still there, apologetic, nervous, humbled. Jet was quieter, reflective, and for the first time truly aware of his dependence and mistakes. I realized that this night was not just about solving a problem, it was about redefining the relationships in our family. I had chosen to help, yes, but I had done so on my own terms. The dynamics had shifted. The imbalance, the favoritism, the neglect, they could not continue. I had seen the truth, forced them to face it, and established boundaries that would protect me from being overlooked ever again. That winter night ended with a fragile sense of closure. My parents had learned humility, Jet had learned accountability, and I had learned that silence, strength, and self-reliance were powerful tools in navigating a family that had long undervalued me. I realized then that family is never simple. Love, loyalty, favoritism, neglect, they intertwine in ways that are messy, painful, and sometimes transformative. And in that complexity, I had found my voice, my power, and my peace. The snow had stopped falling by morning. Sunlight streamed weakly through the windows, illuminating the apartment with a soft glow. I looked around at the chaos we had tamed together, at the fragile truce, at the subtle acknowledgement in my parents' eyes, and I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. That night was not just a reckoning, it was a beginning of fairness, understanding, and perhaps eventually forgiveness. Because for the first time in my life, I had been seen, truly seen,